who asks, was retrieving Oni Judge more a matter of embarrassment or ownership for Washington? That's a great question.
That is a great question. And so it's really interesting. There actually is a letter that speaks to this, Washington wrote, because the first time that the Washington sent someone to New Hampshire to try to retrieve her, she actually met that person and was entertaining the concept of returning. As she put it, she wasn't treated terribly. I think this is a fascinating case of, there aren't like dramatic beatings or whippings or torture in her past. She was a sort of, pampered house slave, but the fact remains that she wasn't free, and that this was the thing that just wasn't okay to her, which I think really, perhaps even more forcefully than someone fleeing torturous conditions, I think speaks to the insidiousness of slavery. It doesn't matter how well you're treated. If you're enslaved, you feel, that you're not free. And so she did actually talk about coming back to Mount Vernon, but she wanted Washington's assurance that she would be freed at a certain point. Which he was unwilling to do because she was one of the dower slaves. So she was part of the Martha Custis portion of the estate, which, as you know, Washington was not couldn't free in his will without huge financial repercussions. So it's a matter of pride, yes, but it's also a matter of finances, because he explicitly says, not just to her, but in reference to the other dower slaves who were in Philadelphia, if they escape, or if he frees them, he's going to have to pay for it. He doesn't want to have to pay for it. So it's both.
Yeah. That whole episode pushes all of Washington's buttons. And I think it's his least flattering moment of his public career. I mean, as a small part of a larger issue, that's obviously the least flattering issue for him. And on the chat and different things, people agree with you about Erica Dunbar's great book. And I know you can't use this with your students, and I can't even use this with my students, but there's also a great drunk history episode about Oni Judge that I recommend that you look up. It's actually quite powerful. So the next highest vote getter comes from Mary Bailey, and she asks about the African Americans who fought with the British and what ends up happening to them at the end of the Revolution.
Yeah, another great question. A wide arrangement of situations, much like just, white loyalists as well, who sort of have a diaspora around the Atlantic world. Some of them do get their freedom. There's a really famous source called the Book of the Negroes, which includes some of Washington's slaves who self-emancipated from Mount Vernon to the British, that lists all of the people that the British were keeping track of in New York that were being negotiated over whether or not they would be returned to their enslavers when the war ended. Most of those people did get their freedom. Some of them stayed in Canada. There are a lot of Black Canadians in Nova Scotia who are loyalists. Some of them go to Sierra Leone and start the free colony of Sierra Leone with support of the British, which does not come to a happy end, to say the least. But I think it's a really interesting example of free Blacks, Blacks self-emancipating, right? So a wide range of things happen to the African American, mostly men, but some women who throw their lot in with the British.
Absolutely. And I think pretty much everyone on this call teaches the Revolution. And this is a great way to complicate it for students and not make it just a matter of, good versus evil and American nationalism, because, the vast majority of African Americans, as you pointed out, and Native Americans sided with the British. And so if you do a kind of exercise where you look if, a student's going to go patriot or loyalist, you can actually do it by groups as well, because it's a really interesting historical question that they faced.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it's fascinating, on the flip side of Ona Judge, you have William Lee, who is Washington's enslaved valet and his right-hand man during the Revolution, who is the only person he frees outright in his will, and explicitly in recognition of his services during the war. And William Lee could have easily absconded with his freedom during the Revolution, and he chose to stay at Washington's side. So I think that's a really interesting reminder that Some Black Americans did choose to stick with the American cause, despite it arguably not being in their best interest, right? So, so I think that also speaks to the soaring promise within the founding moment. You know, that promise of what patriots were fighting for could actually be strong enough to compel some African Americans to fight for the patriots, despite it all.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we can't generalize either way. Pete O'Connor has a fun question about the lock of hair, and he's asking specifically about the Washingtons, but I think this could apply to any of them. Do you know of anyone who has done DNA analysis on any of this, these locks of hair? And it's an interesting question because they're, believe it or not, they're actually scattered in archives across the country.
Yeah, the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is where the Adams-Warren friendship hair jewelry is, has lots of this hair jewelry. They've got some Alexander Hamilton, they've got all sorts of things, and you can find them on their website because these were very much all the rage. And a lot of people got Hamilton's hair after he was shot by Burr in the duel. But I don't know that the Washington hair has been analyzed, which would be really intriguing though. And just in case everyone hasn't had a chance to look at the fine print on that, Washington was actually a redhead. So the reddish hair is his and the lighter hair is Martha's. So that is interesting. But I would have to do some digging to see if, I can't imagine someone wouldn't have done DNA analysis at some point. Although pulling these things apart and picking them out is the question, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot at the Library of Congress too that I've looked at, and I know they haven't, they certainly don't allow anyone to do it, but you would imagine a private collector or someone has at some point. It's also worth noting that the question of the founders fathering children with enslaved women, that's never been answered 100% by digging them up and doing DNA analysis, but perhaps this could help with that question as well. So Benjamin Biddle has an important question about the franchise, and how much was it debated in the founding era about how to expand the franchise and who might get it among these different groups? I know that you share a great source between Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren about they're related to the Remember the Ladies correspondence, and so I think you're the person to answer this.
Yeah, another excellent question. I mean, this is where I think it's important to sort of put ourselves in as much as we can, the mindset of the 18th century. Just by comparison, the French Revolution had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was very closely modeled by Lafayette on the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson even looked it over. But then they also had something called the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen. The United States, of course, doesn't have anything like that. It's worth noting, though, that the author of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, Olympe de Gouges, is guillotined under the Terror. So that she does not come to a good end. That was seen as somewhat radical. And so I think when we remember that, the thought of that is seen as highly radical, and the thought of asking for women to have the vote in most cases would have been just as radical, would have been a real departure from the British model, for example, after which, of course, much of the United States law is modeled. That, this is a case where in New Jersey, when the women and free Black people did have that little window of voting time of the franchise, that was very explicitly women and free Blacks who weren't able to be beholden to anyone else. So they were free Blacks and they were unmarried women and they all had property. And so I think that more than anything in this time period, property is the stickler, actually. And the legal people can chime in on this, but in my iteration, I don't think gender, for example, wasn't even really a concept in people's minds in terms of, should women be included in this? And as I said, the exchange between Abigail and Mercy is mostly about financial and sort of divorce and economic related issues. So yeah, it would have been insanely radical to say that women should get the vote at this point.
And so it's interesting. It's a little bit ironic that the property requirement which in a sense is anti-democratic, really tends to help women and African Americans in a sense, because they can get out of, discrimination. And if early in the Republic, if they have the property, they're actually able to vote, at least African American men. And that's taken away later. And so, yesterday I talked about Jefferson and how the logical end of Jefferson is, universal white male suffrage, which, certainly was an accomplishment in world history, but it was incomplete. And so it's kind of fun to, look at these different contingencies and what was possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really, for me, it's always a really, in some ways, encouraging reminder that contemporary America, for all the problems that are faced, it hasn't been that long, for example, that women have been able to vote or African Americans have been able to vote freely. In some cases, there still are restrictions that are thrown up, right? So I think that's the recognition that something like the franchise is ever shifting and reflective of contemporary standards of ideas and ideology is an important one.
Absolutely. We have a few good questions about Oni Judge, and I know you're going to do more without the document session, so I'm gonna save those for now, and we'll end on a couple of fun questions here. Pete O'Connor asks whether Martha was a Lakers fan. No, I think she liked the Vikings, actually.
I guess I'd have to ask Pete if he's a Lakers fan before I answer that question.
She was rocking the purple. And another kind of pop culture question, a little more serious, from Christina Longfano. She asks whether you've seen Azzy Dungi's Ask a Slave series on YouTube and what you think about it. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating series. And I will say, shout out to Mount Vernon, which has not veered away of late from wrestling with a lot of these tough questions about the Washingtons and their history of enslaving people. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, Ask a Slave started at Mount Vernon, right? Like she was at Mount Vernon when
I think she took it from there, but you're right, it started
there. So, and I think it's also really, the Ask a Slave series, there's another woman who does something similar called, I think it's Not Your Mama's History, which some of you might have seen. I'm not sure if she has a YouTube station, but she's very active on Instagram and other forms of social media. Also a Black woman. And I think that that's really important. The perspective of Black Americans on this history, I think is critical to our understanding of it. And that's one reason why I put the Oni Judge newspaper article in the primary source documents, because it is, even though I know someone asked a question about this already, yes, of course, it does have an agenda in terms of the newspaper publishing it, which skews it a little bit, but it really still is a phenomenal glimpse, all too rare glimpse into the motivations and the thought process of a self-emancipated Black woman in early America. And I think that too often those voices don't get folded into our standard narrative of the founding. And I think, much as Lindsay said on Monday, there's much to love about George Washington. This is not meant to knock George and Martha. But it's also to recognize that they were flawed like human beings, and that they were deeply complicit in this system of holding other human beings in bondage. And so this is to sort of give the other side of that coin, so to speak, the reminder of that. But yeah, so I think bearing in mind the perspective of, that's why I think Ask a Slave and Not Your Mama's History are both such, in part, that's why they're so phenomenal, because they do give that perspective. And I remember, actually, I think one of the interpreters at Mount Vernon, who's not the woman who went on to do Ask a Slave, but one of the current, or at least she was about a year ago, is placed in the what were sort of communal slave quarters that are hidden from view from the house, from Mount Vernon, from the mansion, by a greenhouse facade in the garden. So if you were a white guest to Mount Vernon, you would see this pretty greenhouse and ornamental garden. And then behind it, carefully masked by that aesthetic, were quarters where enslaved people lived. And she interprets those slave quarters for visitors to Mount Vernon. And she's discussed the fact that it's, people react differently to her because she's a Black woman. And when she says something like, like a child once asked her a question about slavery. And she just said, you know, if I had a child, my child could be sold. And that has a very different resonance, I think, coming from a Black woman than it would from, you know, a white curator, male curator, for example, giving the same lecture, right? So in that respect, I think that things like that, the sort of popular history is critically important, particularly in getting other voices into the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, terrific. Well, this has been really rich, and